Hello, Emilio. Good afternoon in this second session.
Hello, Kiko. Good afternoon. Yes, indeed. Here we are in the second session of this monthly meeting of February. And around here, already smelling like spring, with the spring fragrance starting to make itself known.
That's true. I'm going to recommend the title. Remember, Wisdom, the Knowledge, Discernment, Inspiration, and Intuition. What are they and how are they similar and different? Practical advice to integrate them into your life. Thank you, Emilio. Go ahead.
Well, thanks to you again, Kiko. And thanks to all of you, friends, for sharing in this gathering of souls, in this monthly meeting for the month of February, with the title that Kiko reminded us of. And in response to your questions and observations, let's proceed by highlighting that we have received 42 contributions from you, 42 contributions that we have classified into 10 major sections. We will start with the questions posed about wisdom and perennial wisdom. There are 8 topics. Then we will talk about discernment. You have raised 7 questions. Next, we will enter the realm of intuition, where there are 3 questions. We will then move on to sudden inspiration. There are 6 that touch on this topic. The Akashic records in 5th place. There are 3 that correspond to this subject. Likewise, we will talk about the right measure. There is only 1 question related to this matter, but it is worth addressing. There are 4 questions about love, which we will analyze in the 7th place. And in the 8th place, there are interestingly 3 questions about the 144,000 sealed. I say interestingly because it is not a topic strictly of this meeting, but it is true that speaking of wisdom and speaking of discernment, well, these 144,000 anointed or sealed ones that Revelation opens to us, well, they are a point of reference. So that's why we have included it as a specific section, I repeat, with 3 questions related to these 144,000 sealed ones that we will see in the 8th place. In 9th place, we will address other questions. There are 5, and in 10th and last place, the experiences and shared ones that you have put on the table, something we always appreciate having in this case. So with this outline in front of us, we are going to start addressing the different issues and contributions that it presents. The first is from a friend who asked us, is it possible to have a compilation of yours or from some authors you recommend that covers the essentials of perennial wisdom? Well then, what you will find tomorrow in the text that Kiko will provide you, along with the questions posed in this first issue, you will find a kind of bibliography synopsis, in this case prepared by me, of my books, which have been precisely formulated and written based on perennial wisdom. There you will see that there are texts that refer to, in total, there are 10. There are texts that refer to a general approach to perennial wisdom, to cosmogony, to self-knowledge and evolution in individual self-awareness, to Christ and spiritual beings, and to life beyond death. I believe that with these references, there is material that I have indeed been putting on the table over the past few years in the form of a book which gathers the fundamental contents of that primordial wisdom or that perennial wisdom. Perhaps what is missing is what relates to humanity and evolution in humanities, which falls under the anthropogenesis I mentioned, but here there is no reference work. Partially, you will find it, the answer to everything related to humanity, humanities, etc., in the general approach text to perennial wisdom. There is a chapter there that addresses this whole issue. However, I can tell you that next September, thanks to the publisher Sirio, IBA book will be released with the title, precisely Anthropogenesis, the history of humanity, the history of the earth, humanity and the humanities, where we address this issue, which we have not addressed in any book until now. I say addressed in plural because I am referring to my wife and myself, and that within reference works, it is difficult to find, and we have tried in that book, which I repeat, will be released in September, to create a kind of grand synthesis of what the contributions of wisdom are, primordial, concerning the evolution of humanity in humanities and the very evolution of the mother A second issue that arises in this realm of wisdom and perennial wisdom tells us that in current times, primordial wisdom, in many cases, it has been lost or it is treated as myths, superstitions, and is completely denigrated and virtualized by the sectors that currently hold the banner of knowledge. If humanity is in an evolutionary process of growth of consciousness, why have we not advanced and delved deeper into this wisdom, primordial, but rather the opposite, and it has been lost and abandoned? Are there not currently human beings with a sufficient level of consciousness, like those ancestors who thousands of years ago received these sacred teachings, I suppose by direct revelation from the divinity? Have we regressed in transcendent knowledge? As you will see, this friend poses a very serious, very profound question, which relates to the role of perennial wisdom, of primordial wisdom in the current moment. I would venture to say, dear friends, that primordial wisdom has not been lost at all. What happens is that it operates in a context where two circumstances occur. On one hand, there are many of us, that is, there are many souls incarnated at the same time in this humanity. Statistics tell us more than 8 billion souls incarnated at once, something that has never happened before. And it is a symptom, as we have already mentioned on some occasion, of the very important moment we are living in, which causes all the souls that have been incarnating in a chain of life over the centuries, and that we were coming in rotation. Now it's my turn, now it's yours. Now, however, most of us, the vast majority, are here at the same time. This speaks to the importance of the moment we are living in, but it is also true that being so many, what could be the wisdom that is being remembered, that is being contributed at this time by a significant number of human beings, is proportionally small compared to the 8 billion of human beings, of incarnated souls. It goes almost unnoticed, especially when the media, when the mainstream media does not give it space, not even academic circles, which in principle should be closer to wisdom, are distanced from what wisdom truly is. Serious, rigorous wisdom. And they are much more involved in a type of knowledge that is not wisdom, but rather of an evanescent type. And of a superficial type, but without any doubt, the fact that there are so many souls incarnated at the same time makes it difficult for us to receive in the way we should the presence that undoubtedly exists, the perennial wisdom, the primordial wisdom, the divine wisdom at the present moment. I am convinced that there are many, many people, circles, and groups that are valuing this wisdom. What happens is that in comparison to the large number of people who are on the planet at the same time, incarnated, the large number of souls, it can go unnoticed, especially when the major media outlets, I repeat, do not give it space and academic circles do not take it into account. That's on one hand. And then on the other hand, it is true that in these times we are living, considering the sign of the times, I think we can perceive that they announce to us the end of a human cycle. This end of the human cycle with so much upheaval, with so much turbulence, although it is something wonderful because it is the announced birth of something new, which will be a new humanity on a restored earth, but in the midst of so much upheaval, also of so much iniquity that accompanies this upheaval, this primordial wisdom, even though it is there, even though it is being presented and exposed in many circles and groups, goes unnoticed in the sense I mentioned before. So I don't believe that humanity has regressed in transcendent knowledge. I believe it is present and more present than ever. What happens is that in the context, on one hand of turbulence, upheaval, iniquity, and on the other hand, in a context where there are so many souls incarnated at the same time, and where the media and society as a whole have their focus in something else, it can go unnoticed, as indeed it happens. Third issue you raise, I reflect that wise people avoid public office as they are prevented from applying their different way of doing politics for the benefit of all. Therefore, in my opinion, we become, in quotes, idiots, when with our vote we give power to those eager for it for their own benefit. Indeed, in line with what this friend shares with us, certainly the term idiot, as we already shared in the presentation and you have in the text that was sent to you at the time, The term idiot originates as those people who disengage from public affairs and public management. And we also pointed out, and now I emphasize in light of this contribution, that nowadays the opposite happens, given the devaluation, the discredit, the absolute decline of what politics and public management are. Today, politics has nothing to do with that police and the management of the police that the wise spoke to us about. It has become nothing more and nothing less than a way of life for people who, moreover, in most cases, have no other way to, quote unquote, make a living and have turned politics into their field, their estate, to be able to survive and to have a salary, and also to secure privileges for themselves and their close ones, without a vocation for public service and without a true vocation for public management and the common good. From there, indeed, the tables have turned, as this friend very rightly says. We become fools not when we engage with politics today, but on the contrary, when we engage with politics and, as this person says, when with our vote we give power to those who are eager for it. I can only make this reflection my own, which this friend presents to us, as it is very relevant, also from what we discussed in the previous session. Fourth issue, in a situation that requires prudence, we might find ourselves in the dilemma that by being prudent, we feel cowardly, or this does not happen when you have wisdom. Certainly, everything related to wisdom, as we already shared at the time, is linked to prudence. What happens is that we are in a society to which I just referred, where what predominantly prevails, and especially the belief systems, the collective unconscious, with all that it implies, etc., goes in another direction. And it seems that we are always called to a culture of excess, never in that fair measure we have talked about and will talk about again, always at a frantic pace, hidden by speed, always running. And in that sense, prudence, which is an innate value linked to wisdom, is undervalued. And of course, faced with those influences, faced with that clouding of consciousness, we can sometimes perceive that being prudent is like being cowardly or weak. Well, we need to recover discernment and common sense and push this kind of fog away from us, be aware, regain consciousness of how important prudence is, of the link it has with wisdom, and not caring what others say, not caring about these belief systems that cloud us and want to lead us precisely to the opposite, to be thoughtless, imprudent, always rushing, without knowing ultimately where we are going and where we are heading with so much haste. So that dilemma, indeed, it can occur in our lives. We must resolve it with common sense and discernment, reclaiming the value of prudence beyond what those external influences might indicate and tell us. Fifth question that arises, is wisdom directly related to coherence? Well, yes, directly indeed, because wisdom is partly related to with the accumulation of knowledge, with the accumulation of understanding. But if that knowledge, that understanding is not integrated and not applied to life practice, there is really no wisdom at all. Simple intellectual erudition, the accumulation of information, data, knowledge, that is not wisdom. For there to be wisdom, it is required that this be integrated and manifested in practice and in a life dynamic. And that evidently demands coherence. A coherence that ultimately, in the final analysis, is the coherence with what we are, with our true self, with what we truly are, and with what truly is. So indeed, wisdom maintains a relationship of interconnectedness, not only with the prudence we mentioned a moment ago, but also with coherence. Another friend tells us, surely through intuition, I conclude, that the magnitude of your work, which encompasses both an abundant literary production and your immense outreach through in-person and virtual meetings, plus everything else you share through interviews, in-person and virtual meetings, research projects, your blog, etc. It can only be explained, as you yourself share, by the relationship given between the evolutionary development of the evolutionary development of consciousness, of each individualized soul, and the access to universal sources of wisdom. Could you share some reflection on this? Well, first of all, the work I modestly carry out is not a work that has the magnitude that might apparently be defended. From these words, I believe they are filled with affection from the person who has expressed them. It is true that I modestly try to carry out a task of study and sharing that study with serious foundations and integrating it into a life practice that has the prudence and coherence we mentioned earlier. But of course, the contribution I make is an enormously modest one, and I have my ego sufficiently tamed, I believe, so that in no way will I consider anything special about what I do. That in the first place. In the second place, certainly the evolutionary development, yin of consciousness of each soul, as this evolutionary development increases and expands, we have a stronger call to be attentive to those universal sources of wisdom. That is a great truth. And it is what I can share as a reflection on what this person is asking us. Certainly, as the soul evolves, we are called to be more rigorous, to give it more foundation, to seek tools and instruments so that not fantasy but reality is what prevails in our life. This has a lot to do with the discernment we talked about 2 weeks ago, and which we will talk about again in a moment. That is to say, we could say that as our lamp has more oil, we experience an expansion of our self-awareness, and access to those universal sources of wisdom starts to appear more strongly in our life. It is the thirst for truth to which we have also set music. Next, another person tells us, it's a slightly long text, but I prefer not to shorten it. A friend tells us to give credibility to the information I receive online. I use the filter of my discernment, based mainly on the premises you point out, that the person does not seem to have a profit motive, that they are simple and at the same time have authority, that they are consistent in their actions and way of life, etc. My big doubt is that there are people who claim to have consciousness journeys and or channelings with ascended beings and or extraterrestrials, and when they share their experiences, they convey a lot of peace, a lot of love, and no arrogance. Moreover, they usually do not have a profit motive and have a common discourse. We are in some kind of experiment, to call it something, where we have been created by a geneticist or a creator God. They say that evil, the beings of no light, have taken over this creation, and that these beings of light are trying to help us. These people talk about stellar councils, galactic commanders, archangels. Also, that we are on a prison planet so that the light does not contaminate the rest of the cosmos. The great sages do not speak of these things, but I feel that all this is true, and I don't understand why it is not talked about naturally. What do you think about it? Well, the first thing is to highlight the great sages. Yes, they have spoken to us about these things, and they have spoken to us about these things in the language of each era, in the language of each moment, to disprove us. Everything related to Manichaeism, those dark forces, those interferences that prevent free will and place us on a planet that in those times, in that primordial wisdom, it is not called a prison, but it is described or could be described in a way similar to what we call a prison planet. All those kinds of things have been present in certain currents of thought. I insist, Manichaean, perhaps the most appropriate term, with certain configurations of some schools or various schools throughout history, and the wise men and women have indeed, yes, they have paused and have dedicated time to it. It was already done in ancient Greece, and it has also been done later. To refute it, this is not, it is so, we could say that this is an excess of confusion regarding what fire is, certainly, of free will. Free will, as we have often mentioned, entails a freedom of decision. It is in our hands, how many times have we said it, to make virtue our own or not. Virtue, as stated in Plato's Republic, is within our reach, within reach of everyone, of all the transient souls that are incarnated here, and that we make our own. Whether we embrace virtue or not depends on us. It does not depend on anyone else. There may be fog, there may be confusion, which there is interference from involutive beings, from so-called dark forces, but no, there is no kind of subjugation, because there is always free will within our reach, and virtue is always within our reach. We can always listen to and carry out that inner voice to be our best version, to be good people, in the good sense of the word. And when this type of formulation is given credence, where it seems that everything is said from the point of view that we are in a tangle where we can do nothing, that only ultimately leads to skeptical relativism and leads to nihilism and leads to inaction, which is precisely what the involutive interferences have with what, in my humble opinion, and in line with what it brings us, which is done by primordial wisdom. Above all this, be careful. Be careful, because here, in these types of formulations that this person does not remember, what is done is to take it as part of reality, as part of the truth, but it is placed in a context of half-truth that end up being falsehoods. So what ultimately reaches us is an influence that, I repeat, leads us to be in a position of skeptical relativism, nihilism, and inaction. Let's not fall into that. Let's maintain a firm will to be good people, to be our best version, to make that virtue our own, which is within our reach. Let's have confidence in life. Let's also understand that we are in a cycle that will inevitably end when the time comes, making way for a new human cycle in which we can participate according to our state of consciousness, ultimately based on the choices we are making with our life practice, and not make our own. None of these siren songs that really seem to have wisdom, but behind that wisdom there is actually a trap. The trap of leading us to a grand conclusion, and I repeat, to a huge skeptical relativism, and finally to nihilism, to inaction, with what that also entails in terms of disregard, and ultimately due to inaction, precisely forgetting what we are, forgetting what is, and distancing from this wisdom that is within our reach. We have, or should ask ourselves, eighth question that arises. I have read the book, The Mystery of Bilicena Vilca by Rosario Nimrod, where the history of the world is recounted, and it talks about wisdom and cunning. Do you believe this wisdom is true? I am certainly familiar with the work of Rosario Nimrod, and I am particularly familiar with the book, The Mystery of Bilicena Vilca. And what I just shared is very applicable in light of the previous question, the previous contribution I referred to. I believe there is a mixture where part of true wisdom is taken, but it is taken out of context. It's like stretching the gum until reaching terms where, instead of providing us with wisdom, something else is being provided, belief systems that do not always work in our favor. Of our self-awareness, and yet the expansion of that consciousness and our spiritual path. And in relation to wisdom and purgatory, I have already shared in some meetings that from the point of primordial wisdom, of perennial wisdom, it is not recognized. At no point is there a Hyperborean wisdom. The Hyperborean humanity was a phase of humanity that took place many millions of years ago, where the human being had begun to evolve from a purely etheric configuration, a spiritual soul dimension, embodied in a context that was not even physical but etheric, and that began in humanity. Hyperborean, to have a composition, to have a physical conformation. And that type of life, that type of wisdom, let's call it that, which could have existed at that time, is so different and has so little application to the current moment that it makes no sense to speak of it in today's humanity. Of that Hyperborean wisdom, I think it is that simply taking things out of context and ultimately leading us to confusion and a series of conclusions that take us away from reality and take us away from the practice of life that we should be doing and are called to do at the moment. Having said this, we have concluded the first part dedicated to primordial wisdom, and We will now move on to the second major block of the questions you have raised. There are 7 related to discernment. 9th question. It is supposed that discernment is a quality of the Spirit, but not everyone possesses this quality. What do you think about this? Well, discernment is not a quality of the Spirit. Of the Spirit, the divine essence is what it is. And discernment cannot be said to be linked to that divine essence. There lies the hidden wisdom of God. But one thing is the hidden wisdom of God that we have in our divine essence. And another thing, in the terms we shared 2 weeks ago, is discernment. Discernment has a connection with one of the powers of the soul. The soul, we have shared, has 3 great powers. It has the power of memory, the power of will, and the power of understanding. If we look at the works of the great mystics, they emphasize this a lot. The spirit is at the center of the soul, and the spirit uses the soul as a vehicle to incarnate in the human plane. And the soul, under the influence of the spirit, but it is the soul, has these 3 qualities or these 3 powers: memory, will, and understanding. Memory is related to the memory of what is and the memory of what we are. Having a transcendent vision of life, of existence, of reality, remembering the divine, remembering the supernatural, remembering what we truly are, and the imperishable dimension that we have in our human dimension that is related to memory. The will is, as we referred to this term a moment ago, the will is not to fall, much less into inaction, into mere existence. It is a will to act, a will to manifest in our lives the memory we have of what is and what we are. It is the will of conscious action that is aimed at alleviating so much pain and suffering from a perspective full of compassion, primarily for the most vulnerable and the most innocent. All of this is related to the will. And regarding understanding, yes, discernment stems from understanding. And discernment is fundamentally related to the expansion of the abstract mind. That is to say, for that power of the soul, which is understanding, within which discernment exists, for that power of the soul, that quality of the soul to become a reality, it is required that within us, the expansion of the abstract mind is carried out with will. Precisely. The 10th question that you will see in the text you will receive tomorrow is from a friend who asks us, how can I expand the abstract mind, something we have shared in the monthly meetings of the end of last year, 2024, but there is no problem in summarizing it again at this moment. When we talk about discernment, I repeat, it has to do with a quality of the soul, with the power of the soul, and to manifest that quality, for it to become real, discernment requires that we expand the abstract mind. Abstract mind, understanding by abstract mind, that level of our mental plane that does not deal with the ordinary, the routine, and the everyday, as that is the role of the lower level of our mind or concrete mind. Instead, the abstract mind is the higher level of our mental plane that is capable, for example, of addressing the issues we tackle in these monthly meetings, of considering transcendent questions, understanding by transcendent questions everything that is linked to the thirst for truth and everything that is linked to the search, as Christ Jesus wonderfully told us, seek and you shall find, knock on the door and it will be open to you. That knocking on the door, that seeking, is precisely related to that transcendent vision that should lead us to look beyond appearances, to search beyond appearances, increasingly focusing our attention on the essence, whether from the perspective of spirituality, consciousness, science, the arts and creativity, inspiration, etc. That is having a transcendent vision. That is the use of the abstract mind through the transcendent. When we talk about the transcendent, we are talking about all of this. And to the extent that with more or less intensity, whether through videos, movies, documentaries, through reading articles or books, through dialogues and encounters with other people in whatever way, when our abstract mind is set in motion because we bring this series of issues into our life, the abstract mind, which is elastic, is a mental plane that is not rigid. It is a level of our mental plane that is not rigid but flexible, will expand. Expanding with youth. The more we use it, bringing this type of issues into our life in the various ways I just mentioned, the abstract mind keeps expanding. And as it expands, the abstract mind, like rain, a sacred rain, drenches us with discernment. So question 9 and question 10 that you will find in the text tomorrow are answered in this way. Discernment is a quality and a power of the soul, the understanding, and to make it real, the abstract mind must be expanded in the way we have shared in other monthly meetings and that I have just summarized. Another issue that arises, we are now on question number 11. I wonder what prevents certain people from seeing the clarity that this world, as it is going, has no future. Denying the main point without solid argument and without the slightest interest in what others might argue to the contrary. The answer to this, friend, has precisely to do with discernment. To the extent that we cultivate discernment, we become aware, we perceive, we see certain things, if instead we lead. A lifestyle where the abstract mind is not used because we are not interested in the transcendent, and we are constantly, day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year, in concrete mind mode, without ever using the abstract mind because the transcendent has no place in our lives, what happens to us? There is no discernment. By not using the abstract mind, it remains unused and therefore does not expand. And without expansion, that sacred rain that fills us with discernment does not occur. And without discernment, there is no vision of reality. It is a confused vision that one has. It's like Plato's cave, right? If there is no discernment, we are down in the cave. Discernment is what allows us to leave that cave and see reality. But for that discernment to come into our lives is not by chance. One must have an attention, to the transcendent and cultivate the transcendent in the way we have shared. And this is what today, not as a reproach, please, but as a description, happens to many incarnated souls. It happens to many people who are permanently entangled, day by day, week by week, month by month, and year by year, in the routine, in the ordinary, in the material, in the superficial. There is no place for the transcendent. There is no place for the abstract mind, for its use, and of course for its expansion. And from there, discernment does not come. It does not reach these people, and hence they indeed do not see. They do not see what is happening. They go through life like blind people, precisely due to that lack of discernment in the blind. That is the answer that I can share based on what this friend has asked us. Question number 12. When you say that one of the essential requirements for wisdom is the transcendent vision of life, I have a great concern. I could say that I have always approached life from that transcendent vision, sometimes more and sometimes less, also depending on the stages of life. But I realize that this transcendence distances me from most people who are very immersed in the matrix game, as you say, in the mindless entertainment, and it makes me feel quite different. This creates a great dilemma for me. I feel like I'm living in a kind of inner struggle, which on one hand tells me that we are all the same, that I must be tolerant and accepting, that physical life is this matrix with all its joys and miseries. And on the other hand, the transcendent, which is what truly calls to me, almost the only thing that gives me enthusiasm and passion, but it stirs up my spiritual ego and makes me see others as superficial people. This state, it's exactly like a duality between the earthly and the spiritual, the banal and the transcendent. How do you feel about it? Is there something you can share about this? Well, the reflections we've been making in the last few minutes, I believe they already shed light on what is being proposed here. at this moment, in line with this reflection and this question posed by this friend? On one hand, I think we've already partially answered what is being said here. Along with that, I think it's extremely important, because there's a lot of confusion derived from the New Age and the spiritual supermarket with the idea that everything, we are all the same. What is this idea that we are all the same? Friends, what is this notion that we are all one? The human being is a perfect conjunction of essence and appearance of driver and car. The driver, our soul spiritual dimension. The car, our small self, physical, emotional, and mental, and the personality associated with it. We have a clear vision, therefore, of what a human being is. When we say that we are all one, that we are all the same, what are we referring to? Because in the car, we are not all the same. K is K1 and has its K1, as we say in Andalusia. K1 is K1 and has its K1. From the perspective of the car, from the perspective of the small physical, emotional, and mental self, and the personality associated with it, there we are not the same. In the car, each of us is different. We are unique, so to speak. And from the driver's perspective, mind you, from the driver's perspective, we are not the same in the soul aspect, because there are souls with a higher level of oil, souls with a lower level of oil. Therefore, souls with a higher level of self-awareness, souls that have made the most of the chain of life, and have a higher level of oil and self-awareness, souls that have a lower level of oil and self-awareness. From the soul's perspective, which is related to the driver, we are neither one nor the same. In what are we the same? Where does this we are one truly occur? In our divine essence. In our divine essence, in the center of the soul is the spirit, as St. John of the Cross said. As St. John of the Cross states in his beautiful poetry, the soul is a living flame of love, and in its center is the spirit. And that spirit is endowed with the divine essence, and that divine essence is the same in each and every one of us. There, indeed, we are one, but of course, that divine essence is there, evident, underlying. As the sacred texts very well say, that divine essence is related to the fact that we are made in the image and likeness of God. The image is the presence of that divine essence within us. That which has no origin is the origin of all that is originated and is present, immanent in all that is originated, also in you, also in me, in each one of us. That is the image, the divine essence that we all possess. And the likeness is the fact that by having the divine seed, we are configured to live in likeness with the divinity to which we have been referring. But that likeness must be cultivated. The image is there, the seed is there, but to make it a reality, it must be cultivated. And in that cultivation, from the need, from the requirement of that cultivation, where the soul appears as a vehicle to incarnate in this human plane, and of course, the small self, the car, as the place where we incarnate to develop the human experience, that is, where that likeness must be manifested, and there we are very different. There are incarnated souls that are carrying out, promoting a coherent state of consciousness, or as coherent as possible, or approaching the coherence of what we truly are, and more than not. And this is not under any concept or judgment. This is a reality. Among us, there are people, as I mentioned before, who have a transcendent vision of life, and who cultivate that transcendent vision, and who are advancing along the path of spiritual consciousness. But there are also people who are quite the opposite, who are immersed, completely absorbed in the material and materialism. So when we talk about all being one, we are all one from the point of view that we have the presence of that which has no origin in each of us as we possess the divine essence. But be careful, from there, each one is enormously different. These are soul circumstances. and not to mention physical, emotional, mental, and personality circumstances that make each of us unique. So under no circumstances should we in any way engage in any confrontation or conflict when we truly perceive that there are many souls incarnated here who, despite having the divine essence, have not cultivated the memory, which is the power of the soul, the memory of what it is, the memory of what we are. They do not cultivate will. They do not cultivate understanding and discernment that we have been talking about. And from there, they lead a type of life that is absolutely dull, absolutely fleeting, absolutely clinging to what is circumstantial and perishable. And they are not making virtue their own. And this, my friend, whether you are the one who posed the question or not, I say this to everyone else as well. Of course, this is by no means a duality. No, no, no. It is a reality. And it is a reality that is due to free will. Indeed, it is about the fact that there are incarnated souls, ultimately people, who try to make virtue their own, and others who do not, others even who couldn't care less about virtue, or live completely outside of what has to do with that virtue, which, as a great goal, is given to us in Plato's Republic, to the transient souls that are incarnated here. So this is what I can share. I have paused a little on this subject because this thing about us all being one, Noah, the spiritual supermarket, is insisting on it all day long. But hey, let's see what the human being is. And from there, when we perceive what a human being is, our imperishable essence, soul spiritual, our physical, emotional, and mental vehicle, and the personality of society, when we see all this, where is the unity really? In our divine essence. Now, that divine essence is there, underlying, but it must be carried out, it must be manifested, and from there, we are very different, enormously different in the way I have tried to. Remember, 13th question. When we are in consciousness and have discernment, there is no difficulty that we cannot address in peace, but many times we find ourselves in a neutral position that we reach without realizing it. How to get out of that state before life in its wisdom takes us out of here? By maintaining a presence in the present moment. Maintaining presence in the present moment. That discernment must be asserted. It's not something we have there as an intangible, and that's it. No. The discernment that comes to us in the way we have shared is a discernment that must be brought to reality in the here and now. And that requires being attentive. It requires not getting distracted. It requires us to live life with awareness from moment to moment. And many times this can happen to us that we have, so to speak, a discernment gained. But then we get distracted by the dynamics of life, by vital circumstances, by the everyday dynamics. We get distracted, and from there, evidently, we start deviating from what is consciousness. What we have to do is foster, strive to keep ourselves in that state of consciousness, keep ourselves in that discernment, and not approach it as an effort, but as joy. Not approach it as a duty, but as something that brings us fulfillment, because living in consciousness from moment to moment, without getting depressed, without getting distracted, without letting our mind wander to something else that is not effort, but rather joy. And that is by no means an obligation, but rather something that brings us fulfillment and entails coherence. It is linked to coherence with what is and with what they are. Question 14. Do you think it is impossible to discern about oneself? No. Of course, I don't think it's impossible to discern about oneself. Quite the opposite. I believe it is perfectly possible and within our reach to discern about ourselves. I believe that when we have talked precisely about what a human being is, with its different components, we can apply that to ourselves to know at any given moment. Where are we from a soulful perspective, from the perspective of coherence with what we are, or from the perspective of what we are and what is, or how we are developing life? from the perspective of the different components of the car, from the physical point of view, from the emotional perspective, from the mental viewpoint. So discernment about oneself is perfectly possible. It is within our reach, and it relates to what the sages of classical Greece already told us about knowing yourself, know yourself, know yourself. This is the self-discernment that is evidently within our reach and has as its fundamental backdrop the perception of the essence and appearance that are in perfect conjunction within each of us. 15th question, with which we conclude the section directed towards discernment. Is it impossible to believe in God and say, I don't believe? All of this question is important. It seems like a tongue twister or a contradiction. Is it impossible to believe in God and say, I don't believe? It has a lot to do with what we understand by belief, In the book I wrote several years ago, titled God, this is developed in the form of an interview that is conducted with me. And I believe that the first or second question asked is, do you believe in God? And my answer is no, I do not believe in God. Well, and the book is called God, so I am then asked, well, if you don't believe in God, why do you write a book called God? Well, because my perception of the divine is not a belief. Let's talk about a city where perhaps more than one of you have been. I have often been there, which is Paris. If someone talks to me about Paris and asks, do you believe in Paris? My answer is no. I do not believe in Paris. But how can you not believe in Paris? If you say you have been to Paris, well, precisely because of that. I do not believe in Paris. I know that Paris exists. I have experienced Paris. I know that Paris is, and I do not believe in Paris. Well, when we talk about the divine, when we start coming out of the estrangement we have fallen into, we will return to this in the next monthly meeting, where we will talk about the plan of salvation and discuss this estrangement we have fallen into. This estrangement we have fallen into is the estrangement from the divine and the supernatural. But when we start recovering the memory of what is and what we are, that power of the soul we previously referred to as creation, when we start recovering what we truly are, divinity is not a belief. Divinity is an experience. And therefore, when we talk about divinity, the expression believe in God ceases to make sense. It's not that I believe in God, it's that I perceive it, it's that I live it. What the great mystics tell us is that we are called to see God in all things. And not only that, to see God in all things, and to see all things with the eyes of God, because that divine essence is within us and is summoned to be the protagonist when it comes to living life. And in all of this, evidently, the term belief has no role. I believe this answers the kind of contradiction that arises in the question posed by our colleague. Let's now move on to the third section, which is about intuition. We are on question 16. A friend asked us directly, could you comment on intuition? All right. Regarding this matter, what I have preferred to do is to create a brief text that includes the fundamental components and the most important characteristics of intuition. So in question 16, of the text you will receive with the video, thanks to Kiko, you can see the answer to this question about additional comments to those we made 2 weeks ago about intuition. Let's move on to question 17. Many times, random thoughts and images about different topics come to my mind, and I don't know whether to give them validity or not. How can we differentiate true intuition from the thoughts and occurrences of the mind? And how can we enhance that true intuition? In relation to this matter, we have to return to discernment. That discernment which is related to understanding as a power of the soul, that discernment that comes to us as we use the abstract mind, And by using it, spirituality expands. And that use is linked to having the transcendent in our daily lives, and with discernment in the sacred rain. That discernment is in that sacred rain that drenches us, which is the discernment within us. Various things come to us thanks to that sacred rain. Trust in life comes, for example, the fact that everything has its deep meaning, that in life there are no coincidences, but rather life is full of causalities, of synchronicity, that everything has its reason and purpose. When we start perceiving this, it is because the sacred rain of discernment is drenching us. Discernment also allows us to transform belief into experience. Before, we used to say we believed in God. No, discernment enables us not to believe, but to live, to perceive, feel, experience in the way we just shared. And discernment, likewise, in addition to all this, also helps us differentiate reality from fantasy. And it is only with discernment that comes to us, that drenches us and gives us an absolute clarity of idea to differentiate what is reality from what is fantasy. To advance in that clarity, to differentiate reality from fantasy in everything else, and especially within ourselves, the only way is to cultivate discernment. Therefore, to cultivate that power of the soul, which is understanding through a practice of life where the transcendent is present, and where we therefore go hand in hand with the transcendent, using the abstract mind and expanding the astral mind. The next question with which we close the chapter directed at intuition: if the facts, the descriptive analysis of reality, we see them as we are. Beliefs are confusing intuition, true knowledge, and judgment, because they prevent walking the path towards wisdom. Well, here is a term that we used a moment ago, which is to believe belief. But now it is presented in a context that, although similar, is different. Belief systems, if the facts, the analysis of reality, we see them as we are. Beliefs, let's see, beliefs are not how we are. Belief is what we make our own, but it is not us. We are a divine essence, spirit, that is at the center of a soul, which has a series of powers and qualities, and that incarnates in the human realm, and through a chain of lives is called to acquire more and more self-awareness. More and more level of oil for the lamp is what we are. The beliefs that society gives us, that family gives us, that the so-called educational system gives us, all those beliefs, we would say, are far from being us. They are like things, like attachments that are given to us, and mind you, they are not us. And certainly, we should be very aware from the point of consciousness not to make these belief systems our own, which, as if they were computer implants, society insists we adopt as our own. Because when these belief systems start contaminating us in some way, what happens? What we are becomes hidden. They are like layers of an onion, right? The core of the onion, which is what we are, is hidden beneath so many layers. And certainly in the work of increasing our awareness of spiritual evolution, we are called to remove layers. And among the layers we need to remove are so many beliefs that are simply implants that society, which is largely unconscious, places and throws upon us. When a human being operates in belief mode, they are not being themselves. They are not being themselves. They are like a kind of computer program. A result, a robot that functions and lives, or rather survives, under the control of implants and computer programs. It is very important that we remember this, and indeed when we live not in coherence with who we are, but according to beliefs that come from outside and naively or foolishly make them our own. Evidently, there is no intuition there, there is no true knowledge, there is no capacity for judgment, and that prevents us, or at least makes it difficult for us, to walk the path towards wisdom. There are now 6 issues related to sudden inspiration. There is a friend who tells us the following. It is question 19. in the text you will receive. When I was a girl of 6 or 7 years old, being sick, my mother stayed by my bedside. She brought me the thermometer to make sure how high my temperature was. While I was lying down, she left the thermometer on a tray for me to check my temperature myself and left my room. When I picked up the thermometer, it slipped from my hands and broke on the tray. I carefully removed the glass pieces and was left with just the mercury bead on the tray. I tried to handle it with my fingers. Apparently, I did it too roughly, and the mercury bead fractured into many small pieces. This left me fascinated. Then I gently pushed the beads, and they, as if by magic, came back together into a single piece. I did this several times before she returned. My mother to the room. When she arrived, I showed her what I had done with the thermometer's mercury, and without thinking, I told her what I observed. Mom, this is God and all of us. We are all one, alone, and part of Him. My mom was shocked and told me not to do it again. I pondered over this for a long time. I am convinced that it is so. Was this experience of mine a sudden inspiration? Well, thank you very much for sharing this beautiful experience. We have talked before about what we are one means. I will repeat it again, and with the information you provide, dear friend, I would dare to say that this is more than a sudden experience. It relates to the level of self-awareness of your soul. Even if you were a child of 6 or 7 years old, the soul that is incarnated in you is a soul that already has a trajectory of many incarnations. All souls incarnated in current human beings already have behind them a chain of lives, a chain of reincarnations. We may have extracted more or less juice, we may have extracted more or less oil for the lamp, but we all already have a chain of lives behind us. And I perceive that with those 6 or 7 years, from a physical point of view, what was revealed through that experience is the baggage, the conscious baggage of your soul. And what came out of your little mouth at 6 or 7 years old came from the physical mouth of a child, but it was really a soul speaking, a soul with baggage, a soul in quotes that we could describe as old, so to speak, which does not correspond to the little girl who was speaking physically. A child was speaking, but a soul was expressing itself. So I associate this experience more with your accumulated wisdom, the accumulated essence of your soul, rather than the fact that you had a sudden inspiration. Question 20. When we have information but don't know where it comes from, for example, when I'm in a difficult situation, I have the habit of saying, "My God, enlighten me," and solutions come to mind. Is that information we bring from other lives, from the higher self, or from universal information? To answer this question, we need to clarify what type of situation we are in. We are told by this friend that it is a difficult situation. Yes, but what kind of difficult situation? This is very important because in many cases, when faced with these difficult situations, taking a moment to pause, saying, as this person says, "My God, enlighten me," or in any other way, is simply the opportunity, the space we create for our common sense to come into play. There are many cases in our lives where we face difficult situations, but they do not have a component, let's call it genuinely transcendent, where our soul wisdom or universal information might come into play, but simply what we are. What should emerge is our common sense, or even sometimes, in addition to our common sense, our instinct for preservation and survival. And when we go so fast, this tremendous cult of speed that we are in, we don't give space for common sense to appear. That's why when we stop for a few seconds saying, "My God, enlighten me," or what my father used to tell me, "Emilio, before doing this, before responding, bite your tongue," which is something colloquial, obviously. It's a colloquial expression. Bite your tongue and count to 10. Why? Because by biting your tongue and counting to 10, or at the moment you reflect, even if it's in the form of a prayer, you are creating a pause. You are stopping that dynamic of the cult of speed and giving it a chance for your common sense to come into play. When it comes to matters that are not so routine, but of another kind, more significant, we are giving an opportunity for discernment to come into play. Because we can have discernment, but as we said before, in our hectic and frantic lifestyle, we don't give it a chance to appear. That presence is necessary. Being in the here and now is necessary. Expressions of prayer or colloquial ones like bite your tongue and count to 10, give us a chance for common sense, discernment, etc., come into play. Usually, most of the cases we can address in line with this question are precisely related to this through certain formulas that give it a chance because we stop. They are moments of pause for it to appear, for that which we have within us to emerge, which goes hand in hand with common sense in the most ordinary and everyday matters, and with discernment in things that have a higher level of significance. Question 21. Do you need an answer or guidance because you are going through an experience? And in my case, we take the Bible and it opens to a passage related to what is happening to me. Would this fall under sudden inspiration? I consider that it is not sudden inspiration. This is simply giving another chance to what we have, to that discernment we have been able to cultivate. Look, I'll give you an example that I think can help to understand it. I arrive at a bookstore, and in the bookstore, as I'm walking around, I see a book that is also very visible, very much in sight. It's near the checkout, for example, in the bookstore, and I see a book, and that book catches my attention. And I approach the book, and the book is as if it were giving me answers in the title itself, in the information provided on the back cover, in the index. It's as if it were there giving me answers or making some kind of invitation to answer questions that I am currently pondering. Big question. Why do I see that book now and not before? I talk to the person in the bookstore. Is this book new? And they say no. We've had this book for a long time. And by the way, it's always been there. In the same spot it is now, visible to the public and very close to the house. And I frequented that bookstore and hadn't seen the book. Why have I seen the book now? Why has the book caught my attention now? Why do I now have the perception that the book is there to answer questions? The key to the issue is not the book. The key to the issue is me. It's me. It's my state of consciousness. It's my thirst for truth. I am searching. I am knocking on the door, and that is creating the conditions for the external reality that is there, which I didn't see before, to now be seen. This happens the same way in this case of opening a book, in this scenario presented to us by our friend, opening the Bible. Well, in other states of consciousness, maybe in another phase of life, you open the Bible anywhere and it doesn't tell you anything. Now, however, you are in a phase of discernment, in a phase of consciousness expansion, where upon opening the Bible, you always find a series of reflections that, lo and behold, are useful for what you are experiencing and for what you are seeking answers to. But that depends much more on you than on the object, so to speak, with the utmost respect to the Bible, on the object in question. It's not so much the book, it's you. You are the one creating the condition from your conscious evolution and from your discernment for that to happen. I think the example of the bookstore, which surely has happened to more than one person, explains it quite well and is something different from sudden inspiration. It is the very preparation from our evolution of consciousness and our state of consciousness. Question 22. I have heard of the concept of the planetary grid, which is where all the information of the planet is stored, and when someone invents or discovers something, they just connect to that grid and download the information. But there is a surveillance that only allows access to the information for which we are ready. Could this be sudden inspiration? I think not either. It is not strictly sudden inspiration. We are talking about the collective consciousness, that grid, that planetary grid is related to consciousness, planetary consciousness, human consciousness, and particularly with the collective consciousness. There is a case that explains the answer to this question very well, which is the following. Who discovered the radio? If you search on the internet, today it is considered that the inventor of the radio was not Marconi. Texts that mention it was Tesla. In fact, I believe there is a ruling from a long time ago by a US court that declares Tesla as the inventor of the radio. But in any case, there is an open debate. Who was the one who invented the radio? We are talking about the first part of the 20th century. It must be taken into account. There wasn't the dynamic of communication, telecommunication, and information that exists today. Who invented the radio? The reality is that there are 5 possible inventors of the radio. One of them, by the way, is Spanish. 5 possible inventors of the radio. Which one of them really invented it? It is not known. We are not in a position to state it categorically. And what happens, that here are 5 people who are researching, who are investigating the path each one is taking regarding the radio. And all 5 are close to the invention. None have invented it yet, but they are close to the invention. Well, one of them is the one who gets there. One of them is the one who discovers, the one who reaches the invention. And that discovery, that invention, as our friend rightly says, is incorporated into the planetary grid. It is incorporated into the collective consciousness. Of course, the discovery, or rather the invention of the radio, is incorporated into the collective consciousness. To me, who is not researching radio, it doesn't mean anything or contribute anything. But for the other 4, since this one has invented it, and having contributed it, therefore, to the collective consciousness, it opens the door for the other 4 who are very close. And surely these other people who claim to have invented the radio actually invented the radio very shortly after one of them, the 5th, invented it and contributed it to the collective consciousness. This one opened the door, and by opening the door, those who were right at the door entered. I, who couldn't care less about the radio, and who was very far from the door, it doesn't mean anything to me. But those 4 who, through their own work, were right at the door, when one of them opens it, that door opens, and these 4 enter. Surely, these 5 people, about whom there are doubts regarding who really invented the radio, all passed through that door in just a few weeks. And since the media, information systems, and telecommunications in the first part of the 20th century are not like they are now, there wasn't a flow of information to make it clear who was really the first. This has to do with the collective consciousness and is not so much about sudden inspiration, although sudden inspiration is evidently nourished by that collective consciousness. Question 23. Regarding sudden inspiration and Pedro Meseguer's summary of how it occurs, it reminded me of an experience I had many years ago, where while watching a television game show, Pasapalabra, I was sitting in an armchair with conscious breathing and having my crown chakra open to receive any information that might come to me. I was focused on trying to answer the questions being asked, with my concrete mind occupied, and suddenly I had a clear, sudden sensation of something that materialized months later. I mention it in case it might be of some use to complement the method. Well, very good. We thank this friend for sharing this experience with us, which indeed can serve to complement everything we have been discussing in this monthly meeting, and which you also have in the text I sent you 2 weeks ago about sudden inspiration. Question 24. When Adam Smith proposed specialization in work, which consisted of the division of tasks within the production process in order to increase efficiency and productivity, it was opposed to the Renaissance ideal of delving into multiple subjects in entirety to grasp the fundamentals of reality through a holistic vision. I imagine that Adam Smith felt proud of his discovery. To what extent did involutive spiritual beings influence him? Perhaps like the serpent-confused Adamic society? Well, Adam Smith is considered the father of economics. His work, The Wealth of Nations. The title is much longer, but it is commonly known as The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, is, so to speak, the beginning of economic science. And indeed, as this friend reminds us, in The Wealth of Nations, one of the things discussed is the division of labor. Divide the work, specialize the work, and divide the work, organize the work by dividing it, the assembly line, etc. The Industrial Revolution had not yet occurred, but it would not take long to arrive. And these formulations of the division of labor by Adam Smith were important for increasing productivity, for enhancing the production capacity of the economic system. And indeed, as this friend suggests, this, while it is true that it contributes to increasing production, however, it goes or aligns with encouraging a specialization that gradually, little by little, distances us from a holistic vision, from a total vision, from an integral vision, which is what truly is linked to wisdom. And this has not only happened in jobs, as Adam Smith presents it, in very mechanical tasks, very routine. He does not consider the division of labor from the perspective of major business management issues. He focuses more on the routine tasks of the productive work itself, of the production chain, but this has been spreading, and specialization, as we said 2 weeks ago, is now imperative. And the value is placed on us being specialized, with all that it entails in losing that Renaissance holistic vision, and certainly in everything that fundamentally relates to from the Industrial Revolution. Those involutive interferences are present, precisely encouraging this specialization that ultimately leads one to encounter, as has happened to me personally, astrophysicists, for example, who have great knowledge of something happening in the universe. But when I ask them about something more general related to the cosmos itself, its origin or something like that, they tell me, no, I don't get into that because I don't know anything, but let's see. Aren't you an astrophysicist? Aren't you studying such a component of the cosmos? Don't you have a curiosity, so to speak, about other issues related to the cosmos, its origin, its evolution, what came before, even primarily? No, I don't get distracted by these things. I don't waste time on these things. I focus on what I'm doing, on what interests me, and is my work activity. Well, indeed, in response to this happens frequently in many areas and is related to an involutive influence, because that specialization is like looking at the world through a tiny hole instead of viewing it through the large window that, thanks to primordial wisdom and wisdom in general, we have at our disposal. There are 3 questions now regarding the Akashic records. Is it possible to draw an association between biblical prophecies and the Akashic records? That is it possible that those human beings who wrote the sacred texts, endowed with an expanded state of consciousness and from a Christ-like perspective, accessed information about the future of humanity in that universal library and conveyed it in the scriptures through symbolic narratives? Strictly speaking, I can answer this friend, and therefore all of you, that no, this does not relate to the Akashic records. Certainly, time, we dedicated a monthly meeting to it not long ago. Time does not function in the way our mind insists it should. We have turned time into a kind of mental experience and given it a mental form adjusted to the requirements of our human being. But time has other connotations that, at the time, I insist, in another monthly meeting, we have already touched on and analyzed. Well, when we refer to the Akashic records, speaking from our perspective of time, which would require much clarification, I insist. But in our perspective of time, the Akashic records are like the imprint left by what has happened, by everything that has occurred in the universe, on earth, in humanity, over time. And from that perspective, when we access the Akashic records, if indeed through our spiritual development we can truly access those Akashic records, the focus is usually on those imprints that have been left before the present moment. Of course, since time is really something else, we could somehow speculate on whether what is going to happen also bursts into those records, because time, as we shared in that monthly meeting, it is not something chronological, and horizontal, but rather a vertical line, which means that everything might already be written, so to speak, not hindering free will, but from the perspective of the context of the path. That we are going to travel, but from the human perspective we are in, what happens in most experiences related to the Akashic records is that we can perceive things about what has happened. It's like a memory, like a great memory of what has occurred. And being a memory, there is no prophecy. The prophecies referred to here usually do not, I'm not saying they don't have it, because of the time I just shared, but they usually do not have their basis in the Akashic records. But in wisdom, prophecies are related to wisdom when fundamentally, for example, because it is the great example, Christ Jesus speaks to us about the end of this human generation. He talks to us about the signs and omens we will have before us when we are at the end of this human generation. When he speaks to us about what will happen with the parousia, the cut, etc., at the beginning and the start of a new humanity, a new human cycle, in a restored earth, the information from the Akashic records is not being used, but rather the wisdom of the cycles. And the wisdom of how consciousness evolves is being utilized. When there is a deep wisdom about the cycles, how cycles begin, develop, and end, and how at the end nothing dies, but instead gives way to a new cycle. That is to say, the movement that exists in the cosmos, which is manifested in smaller, larger, and intermediate cycles, when one has that wisdom about the movement, what the Hermetic principles call the principle of rhythm, when one has that wisdom and also knows how consciousness evolves, what the expansive becoming of consciousness is, when that is known, when all of that is known, what we call prophecies arise, which are not guesses, but are related to wisdom. And this is the fundamental source of the great prophecies that we have at our disposal. They are not the Akashic records, but the wisdom of how cycles work and how consciousness evolves. Question 26. A few days ago, I had a dream from which I only remembered the final part, and in it, a being told me something that I understood as the name in my previous incarnation. Before sleeping that day, I think since the afternoon, I was quite cheerful and had good vibes, even though I was coming from a very intense previous week at work. The name identified a single known person, and I investigated, but not taking that information as true, rather just to draw lessons from the changes that can occur from one incarnation to another. Life purpose, experiences to live, evolution of the state of consciousness. And this friend, after sharing this experience with us, asks the following: can the knowledge of past lives come in a dream, or does it come in another way? Is there any practice to verify if that information is correct? Well, the knowledge of past lives is related, as we discussed during the December monthly meeting. When we focused on the mind, it is related to a component that is there in our mental plane, which is reminiscence. There is no memory because it is not part of our physical memory. There is no memory of our past lives, but the soul, our soul does indeed have that information. And in the incarnation we are in, this is reflected in our mental plane, in that part of our mental plane, which is reminiscence. It is there. And that reminiscence can somehow be activated by certain experiences, by certain circumstances. And in fact, those experiences or circumstances can be what cause the reminiscence to appear. Not when we are in our day-to-day life, but in the world of dreams. That is to say, the experience being shared with us likely relates to something you have lived, which has activated your reminiscence. And that reminiscence is providing you with information that you perceive through the world of dreams. Regarding whether there is any practice to verify if that information is correct, well, in the case, the scenario you present seems to suggest that you have the reminiscence of having been someone who is known. Therefore, by searching, on social networks, searching on the internet. Surely, as you indicate, you have obtained information about that person. Being certain whether you, in your previous incarnation, where that person relates to what we shared a while ago about discernment, only discernment will provide us with that inner security, that internal confidence that allows us to differentiate between reality and fantasy. And if that discernment has not yet penetrated deeply enough within us to clearly differentiate fantasy from reality, since you have information about that other personality, in quotes, and you obviously have information about how you are now, see if there are any connecting vessels, what type of interrelation there might be, because even if they are very different lives, even if they are very different life experiences between a previous incarnation and the current one, there are usually points of connection, there are usually intimate points of connection, and there can also be memories that are activated from reminiscence, for example, when we know or suspect that we might have been someone, I don't know who, in a previous life, and we know that this someone lived in a certain city. It may be that from that city, even though we have never been there, when we think of that city, somehow there is something familiar about it. If I have never been to that city, I have nothing to do with that city. Why? When I think of it, do I feel something familiar in relation to that city? Well, that has precisely to do with that reminiscence, perhaps with some type of experiences like this. You might have or be able to verify even partially if that information is correct. And the last question regarding the Akashic records. The Akashic records more help me to know myself and to heal, but I have a big doubt. It is said that our soul only experiences and evolves on earth. However, I have been told about a life of mine on another plane, like a kind of light guide, stellar priesthood, as if I had come to rescue souls by teaching through the voice. I am a kindergarten teacher. Do you think this information is completely improbable, or can the soul project itself simultaneously, since time does not exist, in different dimensions or planes? Well, certainly, what the wisdom of the great sages and great teachers tells us is that the soul, which is incarnated in a human being, carries out its evolutionary process, acquiring more oil, its path of consciousness, its path of self-knowledge on this plane of earth, through different incarnations in different humanities. This one, Atlantis, Lemuria, that is what the perennial wisdom, the primordial wisdom, the great foundations given to us by the great teachers insist on clearly. The soul does not follow a path in the planetary chain of Earth and suddenly goes to another planetary chain, to another plane, another world, another planet, to continue and then return, etc. We could say, if you'll allow me the joke, that the soul does not take vacations. That is to say, the soul begins its evolutionary path in humanity, on this earth, through different humanities, and different incarnations, until it achieves it or does not achieve it. That will depend on each soul. It can manifest its potential by reaching a point where what we truly are in our life practice is truly revealed. A process that, while individual, is also collective, because humanity also goes through different humanities, each time with a higher vibrational quality and therefore greater coherence with what we truly are. This is what the traditions undoubtedly teach us. Having said this, is it possible that there are incarnated souls among us that come from another planet, that come from another planetary chain, as it is called in esoteric language, that they come from another planetary chain? Well, yes. It is not the general case, but there are exceptions. And in fact, in light of the involutionary interferences that have occurred, there have been several, but especially the one we call original sin, which we will also discuss again in the next monthly meeting, in the March monthly meeting. That evolutionary interference has not only caused evolutionary spiritual beings to have a greater presence here, although not interference, but it has also caused evolved souls from other planetary chains to come and incarnate here, joining the Earth's planetary chain, joining the Earth's evolutionary process. The traditions also tell us this. Therefore, under no circumstances can the possibility be rejected that your soul, now incarnated here, has not always followed its evolutionary process on Earth, but instead comes from another planetary chain where it had evolved, and where, at a certain moment, out of love and service, it incarnates in this plane, incarnates in the chain of humanity on Earth. Under no circumstances can it be ruled out. However, what I do insist on, because this is what the wise men and women say, is that this is exceptional. That is to say, of the more than 8 billion souls currently incarnated in the human plane, a percentage that does not even reach 0.1%, I would say not even 0.01%, are, in these circumstances, 99.99999% of the souls have developed and are developing outcomes. All their process on Mother Earth in the Earth planet chain, their consciousness process, with which you cannot reject what you have received as information. And if it were true, we would be in a possible but evidently extraordinary circumstance. There is a question, number 28, that is not only related to what we have been talking about regarding the Akashic records, but now about the right measure. It tells us in the current dystopian society, with the cult of speed, killing God, living in unconsciousness, what advice can you give us to integrate the right measure into our daily lives, that balance which, as an example, would mean between locking oneself in a cave or living immersed in this increasingly invasive whirlwind? Well, regarding the right measure, I don't have recent writings, but I have written quite a bit, specifically on the blog I manage, In Heaven on Earth, which, as many of you know, has been running since 2009. It now has nearly 6,000 posts and approximately 10.5 million visits. There are writings that I have personally created or that I have included in the blog, even if they were created by other people, that are precisely related to the right measure. And what you will receive tomorrow in the text is a selection of blog posts where I respond to the question posed by this friend. Specifically, we are talking about the blog articles In Media Virtus, Lack of Right Measure, Health and Life Rhythm, Praise of Slowness, Slow Movement. And likewise, along with these texts, we are therefore talking about 5 blog texts that you will receive. I insist. In what Kiko will send you, you have the links to access these blog entries. And I also send you a video that, in connection with this question, I truly enjoyed recalling and watching again. I haven't seen it in full, but I've seen it partially because it's a monthly meeting from before the famous health crisis. And when we held the monthly meetings in person at the University of Seville, at the Polytechnic School of the University of Seville, and the video also evidently remained there for posterity. Well, there is a video which is the monthly meeting from December 2019 titled To Live and Stop Surviving, the practice of the here and now and simple living. I believe that there you will also find, since it's a monthly meeting, so we're talking about a long video, you will also find a series of reflections and references on the right measure. I think with all this material, I address the request for information made by this friend. There are then 7 questions related to love. A person tells us, if wisdom is ultimately love, could you explain what love is? Now that I am beginning to observe myself, I feel that many of the things I do come from fear. It's as if I am constantly trying to run away from myself. Well, first of all, fear and love have nothing to do with each other. And fear is not the antithesis of love. Fear is the opposite of freedom, not of love. Freedom, its antithesis, is fear. And a free person is someone who has left fears behind, who has dissolved fear. This, in ancient languages, was very clear. In modern languages, some traces remain. For example, in English, everything related to free has a root that is free, and freedom, free, F-R-E-A, free. And when we see what its opposite is, the prefix a is added in front, which forms, for example, the term afraid, which means fearful, to have fear, to be afraid. In English, it is clear that the opposite of freedom is fear, and that when we start overcoming fears is when we truly become free. So love and fear cannot be linked. They are completely different things. What is love? Well, the best explanation of what love is, I found in a work by a person of deep spirituality, but who also was a great scientist, a professor of physics and chemistry in India, named Ika Taimi. And Taimi, who passed away, disincarnated in 1979, among his works has one called Man, God, and the Universe. And in Man, God, and the Universe, speaking of love, a term so overused, so interfered with, Taimi gives us the following example that I share with you, because I believe it is a glimpse, at least a glimpse, of what love truly is. He tells us, take a rubber band and stretch it. With the strength of your hands and your arm muscles, stretch it, apply force and stretch it. And you manage to stretch the rope, you are stretching it. But yes, you are stretching it, but in your fingers, what are you feeling? You are feeling a force that goes in the opposite direction, right? You are moving your hands apart as you stretch the rope, and you feel a force in your fingers pulling inward, right? A force not towards separation, but towards union. Well, that force you are feeling in your fingers, which instead of separating unites, which instead of distancing associates, binds, and unites, that is love. Love is an immeasurable force that always calls towards unity, that always calls towards union. That is love. The opposite of love is what separates, what divides, what breaks. Precisely what the involutive tries to practice continuously: divide, separate, break parties. I don't know what, I don't know how much. Love is precisely the force of union, a force of union that is intimately linked to that divine essence that we all treasure in our genuine and true being. Another friend asked us, could you learn more about yourself if you knew how to discern about love? Well, when we talk about love in its great definition, we just shared it now, that when we talk about love as a daily practice, that sensation or feeling of union is expressed in compassion, is expressed in solidarity, is expressed in empathy. That is to say, the great concept of love that I have shared alongside Taimi in our daily life is expressed in the concrete, in compassion, in cooperation, in solidarity, in empathy, and of course in ensuring that there is nothing or as little as possible within us that breaks, divides, separates us, makes us compete with others, argue with others, enter into conflict and tension, etc. And all of this, evidently, we can discern within ourselves, thanks to what love is in its practical aspect. Question 31. The fear of Judgment Day, or the end of the cycle of this human generation, can be a very strong motivation to draw closer to God. But how can love reconcile that fear in the way it is expressed in the first letter of John? That letter of John, where friends, John tells us God is love, and whoever does not know love does not know God. Love from a metaphysical point of view, and love from the perspective of its embodiment in a life practice with the characteristics I just shared. And in that sense, when love is present within us, when we begin to perceive what love is, we start to realize that the fact that one cycle ends for another to begin is not a punishment, but rather a blessing. And at the end of a cycle, as we are currently in the transition, in the phase, I don't know how much time is left, but the signs of the times indicate that we are already in a dynamic where I'm not saying that we are in the final stretch of this human generation, but it can somehow be perceived on the horizon that love helps us understand that if we are in a universe that is love, because this cosmos is love and is a manifestation of that divinity whose fundamental attribute is love, as the first letter of John tells us, what awaits us, what we are going to experience, is not a punishment, it is a blessing. Certainly, it also has something of a selective process. As happens with all cycles, the cycles that end and the cycles that begin, from the point of view that the new human cycle will have a higher vibrational frequency. And to live in that new human cycle, to enjoy it, to be able to incarnate in it, in that new humanity, in the restored earth, our state of consciousness will have to gain now already in the current moments and in what remains for us. We will have to raise our vibrational frequency, the oil level of our soul's lamp, to be in a position to live, to be able to incarnate in that new humanity, in the restored earth. But since everything is filled with love, we know there is grace and always mercy, that there will always be opportunities. And in that sense, above all and fundamentally, not to see it as punishment, this is a satanic inference. The new human cycle that is approaching, it is not a punishment, quite the opposite. It is a beautiful qualitative leap for humanity and Mother Earth, and it is a complete blessing, a precious gift of life, and a precious gift from the divine. Question 32. In Proverbs 1:7, we are told that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And in the New Testament, Paul urges the Philippians to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. This fear is invoked by the image of Jehovah in the Old Testament, genocide of entire peoples to deliver the promised land. Well, when the term fear is used in the New Testament, fear is awareness, a gaining of awareness. We should not see it as an expression that induces fear, but rather to have a will of presence of what is and gaining awareness. That is the true interpretation of fear in the New Testament. The memory that we shared as a power of the soul, the memory of what is, the memory of who we are in the present moment, that this memory is embodied and that this memory becomes reality. This is related to the expression fear, which I insist is an expression that refers more to the awareness of what is and who we are, and that we remain in that awareness. The Old Testament is a different matter, as I have shared in various monthly meetings about the Old Testament. There is a bit of everything. It should be noted that the New Testament consists of a series of texts that were written with very little time difference in terms of date. They were written in the same era, so to speak. In contrast, the Old Testament consists of texts that were written over the course of centuries. And furthermore, those who wrote it, although they are directly or indirectly related to the Hebrew people, to the Judaic tradition, nevertheless, they were under very different cultural circumstances because the people of Israel experienced many situations, including very long periods of captivity in foreign lands. And it can be perceived that in the Old Testament, there are many interferences from other cultures, other spiritualities, other religions. In relation to the Old Testament, one must discern very well a guiding thread of what is the Old Covenant that later materializes in the New Covenant, based precisely on the love of the New Testament, as opposed to other additions and additives that appear in that Old Testament. And in my humble perception, everything related to fear, the punishing God, the warrior God, does not really correspond to the genuine expression of the divine, but rather has to do with cultural interferences in the way I just shared. There are 3 questions about the 154,000 sealed. Number 33. Since we are at the end of this human generation, is it possible that a number of those 144,000 sealed are already among us, helping in the transition towards the new humanity? In this case, they could be souls that, although they once belonged to the tribes of Israel, as the Apocalypse says, may have incarnated in different parts of the world. Well, is it possible that a number of those 144,000 sealed are already among us, helping in the transition towards the new humanity? Of course, without a doubt. I wouldn't dare say all of them, but a huge number, the majority of those sealed, those souls with a higher level of oil are incarnated here and now, and they are doing a precious work from the perspective of loving support to the collective consciousness into this precious path that we are currently developing towards the kingdom of Christ, towards the new humanity. They are here among us, of course, and it certainly has nothing to do with what Israel is. Keep in mind that Israel at its time is the people, in quotes, that follows the steps of the divine, of serious and true spiritual teachings according to the Judaic tradition. But over time, today, when we talk about following God, that can happen in a multitude of cultures, in a multitude of geographies, and even in a multitude of spiritual perceptions. Although I also modestly understand that it is important for the Christ-like aspect to be as present as possible, with which, of course, to both questions or both issues, I would answer yes. Of course, most of the sealed ones are among us, and these sealed ones are incarnated in different geographical locations, in different cultures, and in different situations. All of them, of course, contributing to the same thing, to this precious path we are on, aimed at that enormous blessing, that enormous gift, which will be the configuration of the new humanity in a restored earth. Another question asked, are some of the 144,000 sealed ones found who are going to lead the new humanity incarnated here now, accompanying at this moment of the cycle that is concluding? We just answered that. Question 35. Are they helped with inspiration and wisdom by the different angelic hierarchies so that they can fulfill their role in our humanity? The 144,000 sealed ones, given their high spiritual level and the enormous amount of oil with which they have practically filled their lamp, have a natural perception of the divine and the supernatural. They have already made it something natural for them, innate. To them, this connection with the supernatural, with the divine, and with the different celestial realms, angelic hierarchies, or however we wish to call it. So indeed, of course, they quote unquote have that help, and they have that help because there is a direct connection. The supernatural, the celestial, is already part of life. I was taught by those 144. And finally, there is a section of other questions, which are 5. I'm a teacher of 3-year-old boys and girls. I work in a school in a context for 8 hours a day, very delicate and vulnerable, where drugs and alcohol are commonplace. From my colleagues, none of them talk about what I am learning. None of them talk about what I am learning on the spiritual path. Superficiality and appearances are what matter. From those who lead us to the families and students, as something to prevent myself from being engulfed by everything I experience daily here, what would be the attitude so that it doesn't affect me to the point of almost having no other thought than the school? Friend, of course, the answer to your question is to cultivate the abstract mind, to cultivate discernment, so that the transcendent continues to be present in your life, and trust. Trust in yourself, trust in the support that you undoubtedly have from the celestial orders. Trust, continue on that transcendent path. Discernment, the sacred rain, will increasingly soak you so that you can live through those circumstances, which I perfectly understand are tough and difficult. This friend continues to tell us, is it because I am not firm on the path? Well, it may not be that you are not firm on the path, but rather that the rain of discernment has not soaked you enough yet. But persevere, do not give up the effort. But from the path of joy, because spirituality, consciousness is the path of joy. I believe this is the line that from the heart and soul I can share with you. Stay firm in what you're doing, trust in what you're doing, and also allow from your innermost being others to go where they want to go in free will. It is also something that from the perspective of spirituality and love, we have to cultivate the allowing. By allowing, I mean that mentally, spiritually, we do not put limits there. We do not make judgments. Let us allow each one to follow their path. And if there are souls that are caught up in the evanescent, in the superficial, in the material, Well, the only thing we can do is pray, in quotes, pray for circumstances to arise that for these souls, and they will occur, there is no doubt, so that these souls have opportunities to somehow become aware and start a path different from the mediocrity and materialism in which they are immersed. Question 37. I want to ask about meditation. I know it's about the past Christmas workshop, but I have been practicing, and I have a question that I couldn't ask you at the time. Besides being in silence and observing with my inner gaze, being in presence, I also like to pray the Our Father from the Reina Varela Bible, Buddhist mantras, poems by St. John and St. Teresa, among others. How does all this fit into the meditative practice you explain? I know verbal silence is important for mental silence, but can a mantra help? For example, more than a mantra, I would advise you, as you rightly say, that Our Father taken from the Reina Varela Bible, those deep mystical poems, whether from that or from St. John of the Cross, from St. Teresa, and this is part, friends, part of my meditative experience every morning. My meditative experience, which is evidently aimed at silence, an inward gaze, conscious breathing, a more calm breathing rhythm, inward gaze, and everything we share in the Christmas workshop. But my starting point is precisely this: prayer. A prayer that is not about praying. It is not a dogmatic prayer. It is not praying to win the lottery or for my family to do well. No. It is a prayer of connection with transcendent worlds, with the supernatural. That Our Father who art in heaven, those wonderful mystical poems that bring us closer, that remind us, that activate the divine essence within us. So, of course, this fits into meditative practice and more. It can be, for those of us who feel this way, your case and mine, precisely the starting point of meditative practice. When we are sick and in pain, I feel that it is harder for us to make space to connect with our inner selves because we focus our energy on relieving ourselves. Could you talk to us about the transcendence of illness to feel inspiration in those moments of pain? It's a question that has a lot of depth, so to speak, to be answered. It is not a part of this monthly meeting to go into details about it, but to this friend, what I do convey is trust from personal experiences, trust derived from the experience of many people, and trust derived from wisdom that the great masters provide us. And it is that dark nights, which include illnesses, always appear in our lives as tools and levers for self-transformation. Everything has a deep meaning. Everything has a reason and a purpose, and also the moments of pain. Those moments of pain are part of the movement of life. Everything is movement in our life. The permanent is our being. The state we are in, everything is movement. The moments of pain are part of the movement. Therefore, let's not forget that they are not permanent. Today, you have it, and when the time comes, you will no longer have it. And while you have it, and while you are in that illness, or in the dark, in the dark night, let's not forget that it has appeared in your life to help you, Remember who you are, to cultivate your will so that understanding and discernment come into your life, ultimately to help you in your spiritual evolution and in your conscious evolution, to strengthen that trust and to strengthen that discernment. Question 39. On several occasions, you have mentioned the term gnosis. Could you share your opinion regarding the Gnostic movement that originated in Mexico? Well, the first thing is to share that I am very familiar with the Gnostic movement that originated in Mexico. In fact, many years ago, we're talking about 20 years ago or so, I had a significant encounter because this Gnostic movement caught my attention. Certainly, I found pearls of wisdom there. I found pearls of wisdom that helped me, but I was also able to verify what we shared at the beginning of the meeting in relation to other questions about perennial wisdom, that with the basis of these pearls of wisdom, other things had been added later. Other things that I verified in the foundations I learned from the great masters and from my own experience as well, they do not correspond with reality. That is to say that Gnostic movement started from a base that has some certainties that coincide with true wisdom, but from there elements have been added, allow me to say it this way, too human, especially many obsessions with the topic of sexuality. To give just one example which mislead them, so I do not recommend this type of movement beyond approaching them, knowing that we will find some things, but that afterwards all of it forms. So to speak, a large painting where the truth remains very hidden behind, an oil painting where the too human becomes too present. Question 40, which is the last one, as a question because the next two are shared experiences. It's a bit long, but I'll read it in full because we are almost finished. This friend, or perhaps a friend, tells us, reflecting on what was shared in paragraph 3 of point 5, from the document, the text that Kiko sent after the previous session, in which he comments on satanic interference by providing humanity with knowledge that interferes with the evolutionary process, natural to it both mentally and consciously, and maintaining the strict plane of the hypothesis. How do you see a possible association between the messages that have been transmitted in their apparitions, our Mother Mary, for example, in San Sebastián de Garabandal, directed at the priests of the Catholic Church, and the involutive influences that it has expressed and currently expresses through some of its members in its different ranks, mainly in those who exercise doctrinal authority? That is to say, is it possible to hypothesize that the Virgin warns the world and the Church itself about the great spiritual responsibility it has, the latter in the course of the events we are experiencing towards the end of this human generation announced by Christ Jesus? Well, regarding this precious question, first of all, I have no doubt, beyond delving into the analysis of specific apparitions, that the presence in the spiritual dimension that there was embodied in Mary, and that no more, no less. She was the mother of Jesus of Nazareth and accompanied Christ Jesus in his public life until the Christ mission was fulfilled. That great soul is accompanying us. That great soul, I know, she is with us. In being with us, she contributes her presence at specific moments, and that contribution of presence also manifests in what are called Marian apparitions. That does not mean, please, that all Marian apparitions are a reality. There are references to more than 10,000. I am not saying by any means that all Marian apparitions are a reality. What I do say is that there are apparitions, real Marian ones. Each case would need to be analyzed, and those real Marian apparitions are related to the accompaniment that this great soul provides us. We are well accompanied without interference, but we are well accompanied. And the soul of Mary, along with the celestial hierarchy and with great souls, are accompanying us on this path. That is a conviction consolidated from the heart and from the soul. And regarding Mary's messages, as far as the Church is concerned, it is true. In many apparitions, well, what we are being told is that the Church is very corrupted, or at least that there is a part of the Church that is very corrupted. And in that sense, even if briefly I convey the following to you, when in the New Testament the Church is mentioned, it is a term from classical Greek that means ecclesiastes, and ecclesia does not mean church as we currently understand it. Above all, because in the Greek world, churches did not exist. So it is not possible that they had a word for something that did not exist, not even conceptually, not even as an idea. In fact, the term church means community, but the community of all those who advance hand in hand, or who intend to advance, at least those of us who have the will on the path of consciousness and on the spiritual path, in the specific case of what Christianity is, hand in hand, and bearing witness to Christ Jesus. That is, the church, the community, which is later organized into communities, as was done in the early period of Christianity. All of this breaks apart from the 4th century onwards, when Christianity becomes the state religion. From there, a church is generated, which is the one we know today, that has nothing to do with that church being talked about in the New Testament, and that is in true Christianity. And we could say that from there, what we call the church, of which there are many, not just the Catholic one, there are many churches. I like to say that the pure message, Christianity, the wisdom, the teachings of Christ, is like pure and crystal clear water. And the churches, it's like pipes through which one tries to channel that pure and crystal clear water. And when we look at the church, we need to know how to differentiate between the pipes, which are the structure, the institution, with all that it entails and implies, and the pure water that is running through there. St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Jesus, and so many great men and women are part of that pure water. But be careful, that pure water is one thing, and the pipes, the created institutions where it is somehow imprisoned, where they want to forcibly channel that water, pure, which on the other hand is impossible because it is water of such purity that it cannot be taken wherever one wants. But those pipes have to do with the church, and Mary speaks to us about the pipes. She is not talking to us about the water, pure, which she herself, with her presence, is supporting and promoting. She is talking to us about these pipes, which are really pipes that are very corrupted and which, to a large extent, are well summarized. And with this, I conclude with a phrase that is not mine, but from Antonio Machado, my dear and admired fellow countryman. In his intimate notes, he says something that very well identifies what, unfortunately, can be the pipe that we must differentiate from the water. Pure, Antonio Machado says in his intimate notes, the Church of Rome has just enough of Christ to defend itself from him. The Church of Rome has just enough of Christ to defend itself from him. The pipes often take from the pure water precisely what they need in order to consolidate themselves as pipes and in some way effectively impede the very circulation, natural and free, of what is that precious and wonderful pure water. We would need to delve much deeper, but it is also true that it is not part of this monthly meeting. I believe that with what I have answered, I have already given some fundamental clues, and this phrase by Antonio Machado, taken from his intimate notes, helps a lot to understand many things. In the text you will receive tomorrow, there are two shared experiences, one from a friend who sends us an article for which you have the link in the text you are going to receive, The Revolution of the Unconscious by Jose Antonio Marina, which he recommends us to read. The truth is, it is a beautiful article. And likewise, there is a Chilean friend who tells us, I would like to share about popular wisdom, some proverbs taken, that popular wisdom we mentioned. 2 weeks ago, some proverbs taken from the book by Gaston Sublet, my admired Chilean sage, titled Chilean Wisdom of Oral Tradition and Referring to Humility. With these 3 little pearls that this friend takes from Gaston Sublet's book, we are going to end this session, and with it, the monthly meeting of February. It reminds us of Gaston Sublet, taken from Chilean Wisdom of Oral Tradition. The ear of corn, the fuller it is, the more it bends. Water, being more important, takes the shape of the glass. And finally, it's better to bend than to break. Good. No. We make this Chilean Wisdom of Oral Tradition our own and reflect on it. And thank you very much, friends, for your presence, for your feelings, for your soulful gathering, for this energy that we all share in these precious soul meetings. And I remind you that soon, since we are already in the month of March, with spring there, spring if we are in the Northern Hemisphere, just around the corner, and the March meeting will take place on Thursday, March 6th, and Thursday, March 20th, presentation and response to questions. And we will address a central theme, sin, forgiveness, karma, and liberation. Integrate your life into the plan of salvation. We will see each other on that date, March 6th. Until then, many blessings. A big hug to everyone. And to you, of course, Kiko, also a hug and many thanks.
Thank you, Emilio. See you next month.